Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is David Ciccone. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science here at George Washington University and Associate Director of Honors, which hosts this talk today under the New Voices on Eurasia speaker series. This is our 7th honored guest for the past academic year, and unfortunately the last before we break for summer session. So thank you for coming to our capstone event. We're honored today to have Jeremy join us from Cornell University. Jeremy is a political science who studies regime and opposition dynamics. I think he's distinguished himself among the kind of group of scholars working on the post-Soviet region by also doing another region, Southeast Asia, and able to make kind of broader comparisons and contrasts, not just what's going on in countries in Eurasia, but beyond. So we're thrilled to have Jeremy share his thoughts on the opposition. Broadly speaking, we'll give him the floor for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then it opens up to question and answers, both from people in the audience here and online. So I encourage everyone who's joined us with the stream to enter your questions in the chat. I'll have the computer and pass them on to Jeremy. But without further ado, over to yours, Jeremy. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks. Yeah, please.
So thanks for inviting me, and thank you for taking the time to come out and listen to my talk. I'm really excited to be here, and this is drawing on ongoing research that I'm doing right now, so it's going to be a bit exploratory, but I research opposition movements in undemocratic regimes, and in particular electoral authoritarian regimes and new democracies. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in this context is the adaptation of opponents to authoritarianism and authoritarians themselves to the digital world. And so that's really what this is going to be looking at under more of a microscope here. And one of the places that I'm very interested in is Russia, which is, of course, how I ended up here. So what I'm going to talk about today is an issue of sort of secondary importance as it pertains to Russia's war in Ukraine. Obviously, the issue of primary importance is the war and the humanitarian crisis that it has created in Ukraine. But for a researcher of democratization and politics under authoritarianism, there's another issue that's begging research, and that is what is the opposition doing in Russia now? How is it reacting to the war? What are they saying? What is happening to them? And what are their prospects going forward? And what I'm going to point out is that the war has served as sort of a pretext to repress opposition to Putin inside Russia and close the opposition space even further than it had already been constricted in the preceding 20 years. And one of the ways this is being driven during the war in particular, for example, is that people in the opposition are the most prone, given what oppositions do both in democracies and authoritarian regimes, to wanting to draw attention to the issues that have become illegal to draw attention to. So this is sort of the mechanism to give you a hint on what's coming, the mechanism that's sort of leading to the hollowing out of the opposition in Russia a little bit. This is more of a motivation than a startling discovery. I think it was clear in the news that this was going on. And I just want to point out a few things first, that what is going on at the level of the sort of the opposition elite, and then what makes it more startling is how much, as I'll point out, how much it trickles down. So probably everyone in this room knows who Alexei Navalny is. He's in the bottom right, your bottom left, sorry. And probably most of you know that he's been arrested and sentenced multiple times over the course of the past year and a half. And all of this began before the war, although some of it was in its timing. But most of what's gone on with Navalny started approximately a year before the war, with his return to Russia and massive protests around his arrest on his arrival. But there are a number of other opposition activists and politicians that are less well known than Navalny that have also been arrested and sentenced, some to startling terms. There's Elliott in the top left corner. He's been a long-time opposition activist. He has been in a party called Yabloko with Navalny that I'll speak about a bit today, as well as worked in Parnas, another opposition party. He's been sentenced recently, that's in December, to 8.5 years in prison. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who you may recognize here from being on the news a lot when the war first started, has been arrested, and the prosecutor in the past week has recommended a sentence of 25 years for him Maxim Katz, who runs a popular YouTube channel, has been arrested in absentia for discrediting the Russian army. And then less severely than these other ones, there's Evgeny Roisman, who's recently spent 2 weeks in prison, or been sentenced to 2 weeks in prison for showing the logo of Navalny's anti-corruption foundation. So all of these are famous and active opposition members. And this kind of activity inside an electoral authoritarian regime is not surprising. This sort of comes in waves that people like this would face more severe repression. And globally, we do seem to be in a sort of wave where this is happening in these electoral authoritarian regimes, or these authoritarian regimes with democratic features. What's a little more surprising is the extent to which the repression of dissent has really trickled down to lower levels in the opposition during the war. So, for example, a longtime St. Petersburg Yabloko representative Boris Vishnevsky, along with another Yabloko member who will come up later, Maxim Resnik, has been charged with discrediting the Russian army, and that's been for circulating a petition to have the government investigate the allegations that war crimes occurred in Bucha. And this is someone who's well known in a smaller circle. He's not a YouTube star like Navalny, but he's an established local level politician in St. Petersburg. Although he did note when the arrest order came down that nobody had come to, or the charges came down that nobody had come to speak to him, as is the normal practice. This might have been complicated by the regime itself. Point out this is a famous incident when many Boris Vishnevskys competed in the St. Petersburg election as part of the spoiling strategy of somebody, I don't know who, to stop oppositionists from getting into government. Vishnevsky has been a representative for a long time. They might have notified the wrong Vishnevsky. So it's also that normal citizens are being caught in this net. I don't want to overload you with examples, but I'll give one more because it's kind of prominent right now, and that's Alexei Moskalev, who's been sentenced to 2 years. It's been in the news, I think, in the global news as well, insofar as that he had escaped to Belarus and been brought back, and he's escaped detention inside Russia. And the reason why he has been sentenced to this is because of his daughter, who drew this picture in school, which is an anti-war picture. She's a child, right? And it says Slava Ukraine. And here it's cut off, but this is no to war. And so her teacher informed on her, basically, and this is why it became sort of a global news item for a little while. And I think it's a great example because it shows how both public servants, like teachers and Russian social media, has been caught in this net, which is important to the data I'm going to point out as I go forward. There have been many instances since the war began of Russians being charged for comments on Vkontakte and Odnoklassniki, which I'll talk a bit about the former because that's where the data comes from. Many instances of public servants losing their jobs for comments they've made that are against the war, as well as many examples of them taking on the duties of propagandists in the war and reporting on students. This is also occurring in a context where there's been an expansion of the foreign agents list during the war. There have been a few expansions of it, and now it's not just about people or organizations who receive money from foreign sources, but that people who are just suspected of having like the wrong sentiments can be placed on this list. And all of the oppositionists I pointed out before are on this list. And this final item of the context I want to point out, in which I want to speak about how the opposition has been changing and how it's been affected, is about the crushing of the no to war protests that happened pretty much immediately. I think the regime had a lot of practice with protests, and in the past it seemed like they had a lot of practice waiting out protests. But when it came to these no to war protests, they were almost immediately crushed by the regime. We know thousands of protesters were detained over the first few months of the war. Some estimates are as high as 15,000. And I was trying to find a picture that captured, to me, what was most startling about that sort of repression of the protests. And that picture for me is like this. This is from Fontanka, and this is the St. Petersburg police, and obviously other police lined up to stop protesters the minute they get to the site of protest. Right. This is the Palace Square. It's at the Winter Palace. So even though nothing of political importance remains there, this is where some of the important moments of the revolution and the collapse of Kerensky's government happened. It's still, I guess, pretty important for the regime to not let that happen again at the Winter Palace. Right? All that's there now is a pretty fantastic museum. So all of this is not happening in a vacuum. It's not out of the blue that suddenly the regime is coming down on the opposition, or that there's been an erosion of democratic features. There has been a steady erosion in democratic features in Russia for the last 23 years that coincide with Putin coming to power. So we can see here, this is the Polyarchy Index for Varieties of Democracy, which seeks to measure how democratic a country is. And it's also been the case that, and these measures sort of contribute to that one, it's been the case that there's been a persistent and ongoing closing of the opposition space and the civil society space over this period. So this is a measure that they use, the Freedom of Association Index, which tries to capture how easy it is for people to start or join a party or civil society organization, and how free those are to operate. And in that pattern, I would highlight that it's not just parties, but civil society organizations like Memorial that have been closed down and whose leaders have been arrested or charged during the war, both at high and low levels. And finally, there's been a closing of the free information space as well. And this is also from Varieties of Democracy, and it measures how much access people have to alternative sources of information. And that has also been closing. The most notable example in the past year in the news has probably been Novaya Gazeta, which has been shut itself down, and then was officially lost its license. So as I move into the data that I want to talk about in this ongoing research, I just wanted to round off this contextualization with this point, which is that it's not the war that the war has provided an opportunity out of the blue to decay some of the democratic features Russia has institutionalized or had institutionalized after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that has provided yet another opportunity in a 2-decade-long period that's been characterized by a persistent and tangible deterioration of even the facade of democracy in Russia that has impacted these opposition parties. And I think one of the most important lessons that we can take away from looking at the long-term deterioration of some of these features is that in these sorts of regimes, incumbents like persistently and methodically chip away at the rights of citizens and at the opposition space, whilst protest and opposition is often sporadic and short-lived, and that creates a huge problem. And that there's one insight for policy, at least as it pertains to democracy assistance policy, is that any sort of help for these people has to be sort of like impervious to long-term stalling or even collapsing of that space, because it's something that certainly happens over a very long period of time, and that can, for extended periods of time, look like there's no hope. And finally, just something to keep in the back of your minds, I think, and that I've been keeping in the back of my mind, is that whilst I think a few years ago, if somebody were to ask if Putin was trying to form a totalitarian regime of some kind in Russia, that would be a laughable question. But the way things have started to look over the past year, I don't say that he is, but that's no longer something that one would immediately laugh off as impossible. That might be the end goal at this point. Okay, so what I want to look at is how the opposition space has changed during the war in this context. This is a work in progress. It's currently very exploratory, and it's inspired by some anecdotal and non-random evidence. Namely that I've noticed on VK, for example, that when I'm looking at the communications of systemic parties, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, they've been less openly critical of government and more supportive of government, and especially the war effort, as you may expect, but I'd like to illustrate why that's also surprising, and what the implications of that are. And I want to know if there's been from that anecdotal insight, if there's been a systemic change to the way that they've been communicating with their constituents and what they're talking about. And I also want to get a sense of how the non-systemic opposition has been impacted by these changes, and a sense of what's going on with the biggest movement, which is Team Navalny. So just to point out, for a point of clarification, one of the ways that we might characterize the opposition arena in Russia over the last 2 decades has been like this, as systemic, non-systemic, or I like to add like fully excluded there as well. There are currently 30 registered parties in Russian Federation, all of which can either be classified as systemic parties, that is, parties that ultimately support Putin, even if they play a small opposition function in terms of, say, opposing United Russia. Non-systemic parties, which are kind of like real opposition, and then fully excluded organizations. Right? And what I think, as I'm going to go through the data in a moment, what I think has happened in this space is this, given the exploratory analysis, which is that the war has provided this pretext that's sort of convenient to crush the real opposition in Russia. The systemic parties, which have usually performed the role of sort of diluting the concentration of dissent in the hands of one or a few oppositionists, have sort of also drastically changed from that role into one in which they just support the war effort and the government. And I think that space closing is a signal that people should rally around the flag, on one side, that there is maybe no more concentrated opposition to dilute on another, and finally that the space, as a signal that the space for criticism has closed. And I think the non-systemic parties are playing into this by sort of committing suicide on their principles. They're engaging in the sort of dialogue that is getting them arrested, that's getting them blocked, and that's getting them declared undesirable organizations. And they really don't have a choice. That's really what you would think in any reasonable democracy or authoritarian regime. The issues that they want to engage in are the ones that they are engaging in. And the implications are this, just that if the opposition institutions in Russia, as they are today, become hollowed out, there's no way to know how long it could take to form new ones. And depending on how you look at it, it took between 12 and 15 or 20 and 25 or even 95 years for an organization like Navalny's to emerge. And that's in the context of, or in relation to how Navalny's organization was doing things that a lot of people, including other parties in the system, thought was impossible, which is getting Russians to volunteer their time and to donate their money and to come out onto the streets and protest, and in particular outside of the twin capitals and in large numbers, right? That's a big deal that happened. It hasn't really happened a lot in Russian history. I'm not saying it never happened. It hasn't happened a lot, particularly for them. And even Navalny needed an institutional home to start with. So this also is, I'd like to point out, there's the alarming possibility that even the space for the small parties is also being closed, right? And that the whole ecosystem of opposition has been clamped down. Okay, so that's the excessive background information. What I'm doing here is looking at these questions. How has the opposition reacted to these developments in war? And what are the implications for the future? And the data I'm looking at here is from VKontakte. The reason is because it's the most widely used social network in Russia. I think the latest stats are that like 3/4 of Russians use VKontakte. And we know from research that it has not traditionally been exclusively an echo chamber for Putin supporters or for the government. That is there, but it is not exclusively what it has been used for. There is, or has been historically, the freedom for opposition groups to operate on this platform and to say things that the regime doesn't want them to. And I know from my research in Russia that party activists and candidates have used VK, or have said that they have used VK to reach constituents. And so what I want to do is use VK to assess the messaging of parties as it evolves before and then during the war. And the VK API is actually very open, probably lending itself to the persecution of users for the posts that they're making that has been going on lately. And I'm able to, because of that openness, get all posts, presumably undeleted posts, I haven't double checked that, ever made by the party accounts that I decided to scrape data from. And so I scrape around 120,000 posts. That's the complete corpus of documents that any of these 7 organizations or parties have posted to VK since they joined the platform. Okay. That includes United Russia, the Communist Party, Adjust Russia, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, Yabloko, Parnas, and Team Navalny. It's not an exhaustive list of everybody I could have looked at, but I think it's the most important players for my purposes here. And I just want to mention before I get into this how monumental Team Navalny really looks here, how important they look. Because if we take a look at what we're seeing is engagement metrics, and in blue, what we have are views. VK records views, alarmingly. And this much smaller time series beneath it in green and red is likes and comments. Right. What we can see is that the engagement on VKontakte with Team Navalny is greater than even United Russia and greater than any other opposition party. That's what we can see here. I'm sorry for the poor visualization. That's what we can see here in terms of the average views that posts are getting. This aberration here is this is LDPR. That huge spike that's throwing off the proportions is the 2018 election when Zhirinovsky was saying some really funny and crazy things. He got a lot of attention in that period. Right? Like I will create the most brutal dictatorship if I am elected president is one of the crazy things he said. He became, at least that's what I became more aware of him as a source of humor, right? Like, as a funny person. I'm not saying it's an unproblematic person, but a funny person. So VK is not unproblematic. There's a lot of reporting going around, especially from Yabloko and from Team Navalny, that the Russian government has been able to block access inside Russia to specific pages that are not blocked outside of Russia. This has been done to Team Navalny's page, and we can actually see this in the data. I just want to zoom in a little bit. because this gives us some important information. As an aside, there's a lot of reporting about how high the uptake of VPNs are in Russia. This is when Tim Navalny's page was blocked inside Russia and was then only accessible with a VPN or from outside the country. And what that tells us is that maybe VPN access has high penetration in Russia. Certainly the government thinks so, and it's alarmed. Just this morning or yesterday morning in Moscow Times, there's an article about the steps the government is taking to convince people that using a VPN is dangerous. Opposite of dangerous, right? But what it tells us is that those people who are using VPNs a lot are either just not using it to access Tim Navalny's Vkontakte page anymore, they've self-selected out, or those are not the people who are using VPNs, or that's not the content they're interested in accessing. But whatever it is, there's a clear structural break here when Navalny's page is blocked inside Russia. So it's not unproblematic to use this data. But it does give us this sort of important side information on VPN usage. But the exploratory analysis that I'm going to talk about today is focused in on this data. This is the year before and the year after the start of the war. Those are my two comparison sets. And what I'm looking at are about 20,000 posts that are made in this period. And what I'm going to show you are the results of a cluster analysis. And this is an attempt to separate text data into distinct clusters on themes. And this is done on documents. And in this case, those documents are posts, which are sometimes a couple of sentences and are sometimes a page or more, especially for parties like Just Russia in the pre-war period and LDPR sometimes. And of course, if we had a small number of documents, we could do this manually with our brains. But like statistics, text as data methods are used to sort of help us do this when what we're looking at is so large in size that we just can't read that amount of information and say something sensical about how to summarize it, right? Because we cannot retain that level of information. Right, and by clustering posts on parties and organizations that I'm going to look at here, we can extract major themes in their communication with their followers, who are presumably largely their supporters. So first, I want to illustrate what I mean by the systemic opposition, diluting opposition to the regime by performing this role of opposition before the war, and contrast that to what they do now. Right? And this is what I hope is going to convey how the space is closing and how they're helping close the space. Right? And I'm going to use Just Russia as my example for this. I'm not going to go through everything. But Just Russia is the third largest party in the Duma today. They have 27 seats. That's not a lot. The point of undemocratic elections is usually to demonstrate the crushing supermajority of the incumbent party. Right? So there are 450 seats in the Duma right now, and 325 are held by the party of power, United Russia. Just Russia is third, with 27 seats. They were formed in 2006, and they're supposed to sit around center-left in the spectrum. And they were believed to have been formed to be second party of power for Putin, so that there could be some alternation between United Russia and some other party. They failed at this task. But it is, as is often the case in these sorts of regimes, once institution has been created and people are making careers inside of them and getting paid money, they tend not to disappear, even if they cease to fulfill any purpose that they were supposed to fulfill. Okay, so Just Russia, Just Russia, as I'm choosing to translate it, before the war, made posts that can be clustered around these sort of 5 themes. The activities that they were doing as a party, right? Issues around prices, wages, and poverty in the country. Issues around pension reform, general normative statements, and anti-mandatory COVID vaccination statements. And so what I want you to get out of this, what I want to highlight is that they're spoiling on opposition issues by addressing real problems in Russia, and also how different they become as soon as the war starts. And so party activities include things like a clear subcluster in this cluster about monitoring the 2021 elections. This has become something that sort of happened in the opposition space after 2011, that the systemic parties started saying there's fraud, right? Which is what the parties that want to win as real opposition are saying. But by saying that there's fraud and that they're being defrauded too, they sort of like negate the power of those claims a little bit. And so there's a subcluster around monitoring the 2021 elections. But there's also content about party policies and virtual meetings with party leaders to let people in the grassroots reach higher ranking members and talk about what the party wants to do. And as an example of the kind of statement that would fall under this, here's Just Russia refused to join the agreement to ensure observation of the September elections, which was signed on July 21st. We have already trained about 600 observation coordinators who will work in 71 subjects of the Federation and train up to 120,000 observers representing the party and its candidates so that we can make sure the elections are fair ourselves, right? So they're spoiling on this issue of fraud. In prices, wages, and debt and poverty, debt collection, they're also including highly critical statements on what the government is telling people and what they're not telling people. They're claiming that there have been more dead Russians from coronavirus that Rostat will not confirm. And as an underlying critical note, I'm going to give an example. They're couching some of their policies here, or some of their reactions to crisis, wages, and poverty on issues that have been sort of like faux pas in the past, which is the demographic crisis primarily. So they say things like this in this cluster. They say that 82% of the poor in Russia are families with children. People are in no hurry to have children because they are afraid of falling below the poverty line if they have those children. Last year, the population loss was 700,000 people. The country is going into a demographic hole. They're saying that if the wages were only raised, Russians would have more children. Unemployed parents should receive a special parenting allowance. Regular payments should increase the birth rate and help solve the demographic problems in this country, as another post. So those are the kind of posts that are going on in there. They also want to ban debt collectors or at least regulate them. And they're also talking about the decline in life expectancy, which is also a real issue, right? So as life expectancy declines, the retirement age must be lowered. But according to preliminary data, life expectancy in Russia has fallen by 2 years, but the retirement age is being raised, right? And so they're claiming that it's set so that 40% of men in Russia will never collect their pension, and the government just wants to save the money that they put into that. Cluster 3, sorry, I fell into the pension cluster. That's cluster 3, the pension reform, where they're saying that, openly saying that life expectancy is deteriorating and pensionable age is being raised, and it's so that the government can save money. Cluster 4 is normative statements. They're saying things like statute of limitations should not apply to corruption cases. People should always be liable for that. Things like in the spring draft, not the one that brought people to Ukraine, but the one immediately before that, that service is a sacred duty and it should not be manipulated or something by other opposition groups. And finally, cluster 5 is COVID vaccination. And in this cluster, they're making a lot of posts about how COVID vaccination should not be mandatory and how forcing it on people is making them distrust government. So what I want to point out here before I go into the post-war sort of messaging that Just Russia is passing down to their followers is that many of the opposition positions taken here on monitoring elections and coronavirus deaths were high, and we need to fight the demographic crisis, and pensions are a problem United Russia is not dealing with. These are all major real issues, and this is how the systemic opposition previously did its part to sort of lower the concentration of opposition in real opposition figures who are also trying to sort of proselytize on these issues. Okay. Blame is usually squarely aimed at United Russia, but not Putin. And in fact, Putin in many of these posts is claimed to be an ally in these things. So if they say, Putin wants pension reform, we want pension reform, you want pension reform, United Russia doesn't want pension reform. That's what they usually say. It's not necessarily clear how Putin could want pension reform and for that not to happen. So the goal appears to be to catch dissenters as they defect from supporting United Russia. We're prying them off of United Russia is good for a systemic opposition party like the Just Russia, but not allowing them to fall out and actually support the real opposition is also good for them. So these are the sort of like trespass issues that they're going on, but this is what happens when the war starts. What you'll see is also a huge contrast between what they do when the war starts and what the non-systemic opposition does when the war starts. So the war starts, the Just Russia starts passing down technical commentary on the war that repeats government propaganda points, represents Ukraine and Europe as weak or about to collapse, and justifies the war and minimizing any harm on Russia. And then they also continue making points on minute politics, but there's really not much less criticism of anything that's going on. And then they justify central government decisions given the global context instead of actually drawing like a line and saying that something that's going on with the central government decisions is wrong. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the technical commentary because some of it's a little bit alarming. So one is this: in the course of the special operation in Ukraine, hundreds of documented evidences of violations the laws of war by the Ukrainian side are appearing. To distract the attention of the West from the torture and execution of Russian prisoners in Ukraine, and to prepare public opinion for an increase in arms supplies for the Ukrainian armed forces, Ukraine creates large-scale fakes about the atrocities of the Russian army in Bucha, Gostomel, and then beneath this post, they provide a link where one of the senior members is going to explain to people in a live stream exactly how those fakes are created and played out. Right? They have another post where they say airstrikes on infrastructure in Ukraine has destroyed the will of the Ukrainian army to continue. And all it's going to take for the whole Ukrainian side to collapse is for the families of Ukrainian servicemen who don't even want to be fighting this war, come out and protest the government in Kiev. Then everything will be over. If only they were allowed to come out and protest. Okay. I'm going to move past the other two examples, but they have to do with just everyday politics. And that sort of helps couch what they're saying about the war, which is, in terms of facts on the ground, false, right? In some level of legitimacy, right? So by engaging in real politics, they're sort of blending right to the first cluster. And what I want to do first is contrast them with Yabloko. Yabloko is a non-systemic opposition party. They've been around since the first elections after the Soviet Union and Russia. They've never been a huge electoral force, but they have been considered by many people at different points in time to be part of the real opposition, albeit small. And in the pre-war period, their posts can be clustered into these 5 themes. This is the smallest number of clusters that we use to capture the themes that they're covering. And these are repression, focusing on their favorite issues and talking about how the government fails on those. Issues around freedom and liberty, giving biographies of members, and because this is the year before the 12 months leading up to the war, also the 2021 elections. So repression of Yabloko members has been something that's been ongoing for a long time. And so they make statements like, not as on a high level as what has happened to Navalny, for example, but on a lower level, this has happened a lot. And so they have statements in here like the Kremlin is preparing for the elections in its own way, and that is by having security forces arrest a couple of our politicians. Or they'll say the Yabloko team has been subjected to a campaign of harassment and defamation. Party's campaign was disrupted by all means possible, and the election commission is not responding to our request for help. Right? In cluster 2, favorite issues, they're just talking about issues that they can define them. Some of those have been in the environment. After 2014, that was Crimea. Big issue in this period is the pension. So they're also speaking about the pension reform. They're saying now, according to Rosstat, the average pension in this country is less than 16,000. How does it feel to survive on that amount of money? You judge for yourself, but we'll remind you that Yabloko has long been advocating to transfer dividends from state companies and state corporations to the pension. So this is a direct overlap with a Just Russia. In cluster 3, there's just statements around freedom and liberty. For example, fear, freedom, and the fact that Belarusians themselves will choose their future and that the citizens of our country will want the same, led the Russian authorities to exchange century-old brotherly relations between our peoples for support of the dictator. In cluster 4, there's just member biographies. That is the backgrounds of Yabloko candidates leading into the elections. And in cluster 5, there's just posts about the elections, about meetings to talk to candidates, and about what they're competing on. So note how Yabloko overlaps with the Just Russia on some important issues. Those would include pensions here, and how, unlike a Just Russia, Yabloko does not overlap on issues like the repression of members. Right, a Just Russia is not experiencing that level of repression. And this is an important part of the story of how we can see the difference between systemic and non-systemic opposition, in that the systemic opposition competes with the non-systemic opposition on some of the same issues, but they're permitted to do so, and they do not challenge Putin, and the non-systemic opposition faces physical repression and lawfare. But where they really diverge is then when the war starts. When the war starts, a lot of issues happen in Russia. But was this the right thing to do? Were the justifications true? What are the effective sanctions? What are the military casualties? Are we committing atrocities against civilians in Ukraine? All of these are issues that you would expect to see covered in any democracy that does this. Those kind of issues that we saw covered in Afghanistan and Iraq. So exactly the sort of questions that the Democrats were asking. Was this actually happening? Was the justification correct? Are we hurting civilians? Are we dying at unreasonable rates? So these are the kind of things people ask. And so these are the kind of things that the opposition in Russia is trying to. And Yabloko can be clustered around three themes here across all their posts. Most of them can be classified as either references to civilian casualties in Ukraine, to military casualties of Russians, and to anti-war actions. Right. So for civilian casualties, they're re-reporting UN statistics. So, for example, they say the UN publishes its civilian casualty figure once a week. On October 17th, there's been an increase of 68 deaths, including 5 children. The number of wounded has increased by 174, including 12 children. When it comes to anti-war activities, they point out that although they're not calling people out to the streets in massive protests, they are saying things as individual politicians and activists and suffering consequences for them. So, for example, they post the head of the Yabloko faction in the Legislative Assembly of St. Petersburg, Alexander Shishlov, made an anti-war speech to journalists, stating there's a special emergency session of the UN General Assembly in New York. Listen to what they're saying about our country. The war must be stopped. The position against the war is shared not only by the Yabloko Party and our voters, it is shared by millions of people in Russia. And in cluster 3, they are just conveying military casualties, and the posts just look like this. In one day, there were 90 more people killed and 27 more wounded. Right? So these are the issues that they focus on since the war started, and these are the issues that Just Russia has focused on since the war started, which is just rehashing government propaganda, technical commentary about how examples I didn't read, how Europe is going bankrupt over this, America is going bankrupt, support is going to stop, nobody in Ukraine wants to fight them. They're winning. Everything is awesome. So again, note how Yabloko and Just Russia no longer overlap when the war starts. All the non-systemic opposition can focus on is the war, and the aspects of the war that beg criticism and critical interrogation are illegal to talk about. And so this is getting them in a lot of trouble. Their pages are getting blocked. People are getting arrested. People are being charged with discrediting the Russian forces. 2 minutes. Oh, I must have paused this. Okay, sorry. It's been saying 23 minutes for a long time. I apologize. Not have gone into so many examples. Okay. Okay, so I can move through Navalny quite quickly. And I'm looking at Team Navalny's page here, and they're just they're notably different. In the pre-war period, this includes the arrest of Navalny and the protests against his arrest in January 2021. And so they can be, all their posts can be clustered around following Navalny's trial and then linking to other platforms. More than Yabloko, more than Just Russia, Team Navalny uses Vkontakte to link people to their more popular platforms, which is mainly YouTube, where they get across several channels, depending on which channel, either millions of views per video or hundreds of thousands of views. And saying that that's the more popular platform is important because they have the most popular political Vkontakte page out of all these parts. Right? They're more popular than the government in Russia on the Russian social media platform. And in the war, they switched to much more. They posted, them and United Russia posted more than anybody else in the war period. And so it's difficult to get a small number of clusters, and the smallest number that's efficient are all of these protests, 3 consistent links to new news channels on the Popular Politics channel they've created on YouTube, issues around corruption, Navalny's case, money and VPNs, and then reporting on YouTube. I don't have time to give you examples, fortunately or unfortunately. So what I'm going to do is fast forward to my conclusions that I wanted to. Again, this is exploratory work on this corpus I've scraped of these 120,000 posts that these opposition parties have made. And what I really wanted to look at in the research that I'm doing right now is how the space has been altered by the war. How I'm saying that space has been altered, given the way this descriptive data looks, is that the systemic parties like Just Russia, like the Communist Party of Russia, like the Liberal Democratic Party, they have moved away from trying to dilute the opposition by jumping on or spoiling some of the policies that the opposition or some of the issues that the opposition wants to talk about. And they moved into a space where they only will talk about minute politics without heavily criticizing the government and rehash justifications for the war, right? So they're signaling to people who follow them, however many of those people there are, that that space is closed. It's time to rally around the flag. There's no more room for criticism. Whereas the non-systemic opposition is trying to engage on the issues that really matter in domestic Russia around the war, and that's getting them arrested, and that's getting them put in prison, and that's destroying that space. And the implications are that this whole ecosystem for opposition in Russia, it could be being hollowed out right now, and there are no alternatives, right? And it's important to note that if I have like a final couple of points, is that it took a movement like Navalny's an extremely long time to emerge. There are people in my research who said directly to me, if asked like why they don't try to do stuff like that before Navalny became extremely big, they would say Russians don't want to volunteer. Russians are not going to donate their like money, like grassroots donations is not going to work for us, right? Navalny being able to do that was a big deal, and even he needed this ecosystem with all these smaller parties to jump off of, right? And all of that is sort of being hollowed out, and there's no replacement. There are some analysts who are saying that there are other movements coming out like Vesna or like the Free Russia Forum, the Russian Anti-War Committee, the Congress of People's Deputies since the war started. But if you look at their engagement on Telegram and YouTube and Contacte and Twitter and any space where they're saying things to people, it's almost non-existent. You're getting like 12 people, 100 people, or like 500 people. That's great. But when Navalny says something, he gets 8 million people to look at it, right? That's a big difference. So that's an important difference, that there's just not something to replace this ecosystem that's immediately obvious. I'm assuming I'm out of time. So that is my talk, so just to highlight again how this opposition space has changed and how it is very likely being hollowed out in a quasi-permanent way. In a way, it's not immediately obvious how people are going to replace these organizations, including with the ones that exist right now, which do not seem to be anywhere near as popular.
Thank you. We have a fair amount of time to open it up to questions. As chair prerogative, I usually like to kick it off with something to get the conversation started. A lot of the results we had are fascinating. For me, the most enigmatic of the different groups that you described is the systemic composition. Because there's been talk for years about how fractures or defectors or radicals are harboring in systemic opposition parties and potentially pulling them apart at the seams, and using formal access, could potentially use formal access power to make life difficult regime. And I was kind of surprised by your cycle that it wasn't as gung-ho pro-war rhetoric as I kind of expected. It was like the idea of kind of a neutrality or staying in the sidelines, saying just enough, not get in trouble, but not jumping on the bandwagon. So I want to hear more about how you interpret, is that hesitation, or, I mean, you worked a lot closer with the actual content of these messages. How would you characterize it? Do you see more people that are willing to put lapsha on their ears while they're watching the annual address, or is this an opposition that has like strictly fallen in line and is demonstrating it just through silence and like acquiescence to status quo?
Great question. Thanks. So I think that when it comes to parties like Just Russia, for example, so we can't know if the things that they're saying support the war are real or not. I think in the case of like Sergei Muranov's statements that they are, from like, or at least that he's willing to say with like with enthusiasm and venom, like that this is a good thing. But for like in terms of like true dissenters trickling down into these systemic parties, I think that like that's paraphrasing a party like Yablka, where there are people like that, and that's a big story. Like that they came up in my research. There were young people in the Yablka movement who joined because they thought it was the only real sort of opposition, and they were simultaneously in completely excluded movements like Navalny's, that they wanted to be in a party that was registered and that could compete and that they could do politics things. But I think the examples from the other parties are too out from LDPR who turned out to be the original opposition was. I think like at least for say Just Russia right now, that they really think of those. And the Communist Party of Defense, I think they see posts of them like in the war zone saying, yes, that's not just the Russians here is the Communist Party.
Let's open it up to the audience. If you just introduce yourself for us.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name is Sofia Glazunova. I'm a Building Minister Fellow in Wilson Center, but I work in Australia. Your presentation left me a little bit puzzled, and I have several questions and slash comments in terms of first your understanding of the political regime in Russia, but also the notion of opposition, non-systemic opposition, systemic opposition. So first you said several times that Russian regime is a lateral authoritarian regime. This is literature from 2010s by Grigori Golosov or Levitsky Way. For the last 2-3 years and since the end of 2010s, nobody, I think, really mentions electoral authoritarianism because it's clear that Russia's maybe on the way, but maybe already is a dictatorship. So this is the first question. The first question in regards to how do you consider Russian regime right now. Second question, several things that also left me puzzled. For example, when you consider Yabloko as a non-systemic party, it was in 4 communications of the State Duma, and I checked now it's also 11 people from the Yabloko party are in regional parliaments, why it's non-systemic in a sense. And in this sense as well, Team Navalny is not a party. It's a gathering online of people who are like movement together. We're talking about the Navalny's party, Russia's future. So this is the second point. Third point about Kontakte. If you look at the history of Kontakte since 2010s, since actually process for fair elections in 2010 and 11, Russian opposition do not really use Kontakte, mainly because there's a lot of pressure from intelligence services. Durov himself left Kontakte. I'm doing now research on the communication of the Russian opposition. It's a finer middle and stuck. They don't use it. Lukov Sobol is not using Kontakte. Groisman is not using Kontakte. He's now used the basically using some symbolic of Navalny's movement, but at the same time, it's a group that are not. He's not there. So why did you choose Kontakte for studying the opposition?
I think
yes.
we get maybe you could take the ones you want.
Yeah, so those are great comments. I agree with a lot of what you said. Yeah, so I mean, the regime it is by definition an electoral authoritarian regime. There are multiple parties and they hold elections. They're not a democracy, but that's the definition, right? So there is a range. Usually the EA regime, name like it's like a hanger in which you can put all the other specific regimes. If you're referencing like competitive authoritarianism from Levitsky and Way, it's not a competitive authoritarian regime. Also, by definition, it would be a hegemonic authoritarian regime. If we're using that typology of like how many seats does the incumbent party have? It's usually how they discriminate between competitive and hegemonic. But if there are any seats that are not held by the incumbent, then it's still an EA regime by definition. That doesn't mean that it's fair. It's mainly meaningless argument to have, I think, because I'm not saying they're democracy, they're definitely not. Opposition space is not there. In terms of Team Navalny, you're right, so it's not a party. If I said that, I apologize. So I'm talking about parties and organizations, and it's just impossible not to talk about Team Navalny when you're talking about the opposition space, which is why they're included. And in terms of Yabloko, that's your hesitation is correct, right? They are in regional parliament, but they are also targeted for lawfare and physical repression at the individual level. And they also criticize government more than other parties. And it is true that people do join Yabloko because they want to be in the real opposition, and I found in my research with them that there are a lot of young activists who are both in the development organization and in Yabloko. In terms of book contact, you could be right, but you're also wrong. Like Team Development posts more than any other group. If Yevgeny Roizman is not on there, or Subal is not on there, that's okay. It's not the only platform. I think it's important. That's the data I'm presenting here. I think the whole space should be part of any final analysis for Contact Day. Obviously Telegram, obviously too. Right? This was just an opportunity to take this large amount of data and sort of expose the text that parties were using to communicate with their followers to text analysis. But they are absolutely on book Contact Day. That's, for me, that's very interesting because everybody assumes, I guess, and that is correct. I think that the government is monitoring them on that since Iraq lost control of DK. I mean, you can see that yourself every time I log in. Some beautiful person with one follower asked me to be friends, and now the API has been loosened even more. That it's gone from request to you can now be directly messaged through a bot. So that's happening as well. I've had a few requests to by a wife, I guess, which I don't know if that's a way into surveillance or if it's a business. I suspect a lot of that is surveillance. I think you're right and you're wrong. I think because so many Russians are on VK, a lot of these groups are trying to use them to catch people and take them to these freer platforms. They do get blocked in Russia, but they do make posts like Sinovaldo, Yabloko, Parnas is off. People are being blocked. They are posting. Telegram is more important. This is the data I was looking at here because more Russians are consuming. And sorry, I can't remember if that's everything.
I've got a question from the online audience. What is the main mistake of the Russian opposition, Mikhail? Non-systemic, excluded, like the two categories that you came up with. According to the words of the opposition itself, how does the opposition realize and articulate its mistakes, if at all?
That's a good question. I don't know if they're making mistakes. There's just the regime in Russia is strong. Right? If I look at the activities that Tina Navalny has tried to do, did that result in them being repressed? Yes. Right? But was there some alternative where they just didn't do anything and still were successful with it anyway? Probably not. Right. And the same goes for this. I mean, Yabloko is a great example of that because a lot of their history is let's not do something big because that's going to draw attention to it. And so that keeps them on the edge of relevancy. Right? So, yeah, I'm not sure if I would characterize any opposition that I've studied anywhere really is certainly doing something wrong, because even if they do something that really results in a horrible outcome, often what they've done that has that result is the thing that they have to do, just to try to have some kind of effect. And it's when they become too effective, right, that authoritarians are usually you're on my list.
Another question for you, yes, please.
Yes, my name is Edward Ludansky. I'm at American University in Moscow, and Yabloko was mentioned here many times. So I want to give you a little quote and then fill out the situation. A quote directly from Yavlinsky. I found it in newspaper Washington Times, so it's not Russian propaganda. So just go on this. Okay, Grigory Yavlinsky, the most prominent candidate, pro-Western candidate, at the head of at the time he was head of the Yabloko party. And he was running for president of Russia in 1996. So he said that NATO expansion would strengthen anti-democratic forces. It would give them to those people the opportunity to speculate about threat of NATO, to strengthen their power without space. So this is Grigory Yavlinsky, Yabloko. He spoke the same thing here in Washington. He was here at the conference at Pater.
Could you put in a question so we
can... yeah. Question is, what's your, I know that might be not directly related to your talk, but what do you think? Is Yavlinsky right? That if not for NATO expansion in 1998 and follow-up, maybe opposition would have a better chance. They were in parliament, and in at the beginning of post-Soviet Union, America was top 95% of Russians Latin America in order to follow the United States.
Thank you.
So was he right that NATO expansion?
Strengthen anti-democratic forces.
I mean, I don't know if I can answer that, but it would be speculation, I think, for me to answer that question. It's not directly in my research. Certainly now it looks that way. Right, that, if what I'm looking at now is saying that the opposition space is really being closed as a result of the war, and if that is the justification for the war, then that seems like that follows, but it's really outside of my ability to.
But not
So any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kurt Kramer, and I'm just an American citizen. Do you foresee any circumstances, events in which Navalny becomes the leader of Russia?
So the way I would answer that question is just that we don't have access to, like, the full historical record until it's over, right? So when Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested, in the 90s, right, and spent about 20 years under house arrest, and the NOB was illegal, nobody thought that she was going to be the leader of, a democratic Burma, even though that has failed now, right? But that did happen, right? And part of that story is really that because she survived that experience, that may have strengthened the NOB insofar as the leader and so many of the activists spent time in prison along with normal democratic activists. And so at least in that moment, it looked like, something that was impossible became possible. So, it's hard to say, right? If he survives and if there's an opening, it's possible. But that's just, that's really impossible to answer.
All right, one more quick question from online, Melina. Do you think that the small opposition groups like the Anti-War Forum, the Free Russia Forum, the Indigenous Peoples movements could realistically, work together and cooperate? Are there any signs of this, or are the relations still conflictual? You can answer in less than 2 minutes because we're running up pretty close to our time today.
Yeah, great. So in terms of like the research I've done on them, I've only been looking at like their levels of engagement over time. So I haven't been looking at if they're communicating with each other and to what extent. I know one of those, I have it in my notes, I can't remember which one is like a collaboration of several. That might be the answer for it, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure how to answer that question. I really don't know. So basis on which to say that they could or could not.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for sharing your research. Thank you all for coming. We're out of time, but Jeremy will still be here. So if you want to grab him after the talk and ask your question in person, I'm sure he'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us for this year-long New Voices on Eurasia Speakers series, and we look forward to another great slate of speakers starting in the fall.